What does it actually cost to be the most famous person on the planet? Not in money, in freedom. BTS didn't just become famous. They became a national symbol, a diplomatic tool, a cultural force so large that the South Korean government literally rewrote military law because of them. 7 young men from a mid-tier Seoul agency went from performing in tiny venues to filling NFL stadiums, and somewhere along that journey, the ordinary things most people take for granted quietly disappeared from their lives. Can you walk into a convenience store at midnight without a security detail? Can you post whatever you want on social media without it becoming international news? Can you date someone without the relationship being dissected by millions of strangers who feel personally betrayed? Can you even choose when to serve your country, or does the government decide that for you? These aren't hypothetical questions for BTS. These are the real, documented boundaries of their daily existence. 7 people. Global fame. A surprisingly short list of things they can actually do freely. Let's get into it. Number 7, no spontaneous public appearances, Jin. Kim Seokjin, the oldest member of BTS, born December 4, 1992, in Gwacheon, South Korea, is by most measurable standards one of the most recognizable human beings on Earth. And that recognition comes with a specific, well-documented consequence: he cannot simply go outside. Not in the way most people understand going outside. Not without planning, coordination, security logistics, and the near-certain guarantee that the moment his presence becomes known, the surrounding area transforms into something that requires crowd management. This isn't an exaggeration dressed up as a fact. It's a structural reality of BTS's existence that Jin himself has addressed directly and repeatedly across interviews, fan communication platforms like Weverse, and variety show appearances. During a 2021 episode of Run BTS, members openly discussed how even low-profile outings, a walk, a meal, a quick errand, require advanced preparation that most people associate with visiting a foreign country, not grabbing coffee. Jin, as the most visually striking member according to widespread public consensus and Korean media coverage, has specifically noted that his face recognition rate in public spaces makes unplanned movement functionally impossible in South Korea, and in most major cities worldwide. The scale of BTS's fanbase, ARMY, is not a casual cultural phenomenon. As of their peak activity years between 2018 and 2022, BTS had sold out stadiums with capacities exceeding 40,000 seats across North America, Europe, and Asia within minutes of ticket release. Their combined social media presence across platforms numbered in the hundreds of millions of followers. When a BTS member is spotted in public without security preparation, the resulting crowd congregation has, on documented occasions, created genuine public safety concerns. This has been reported by South Korean media on multiple occasions, including incidents near the HYBE headquarters building in Yongsan, Seoul, where fans gather with enough regularity that the surrounding streets have developed an informal but well-known reputation as a stakeout zone. Jin's post-military discharge in June 2024 brought this reality back into sharp focus. His return from mandatory military service, which he completed as the first BTS member to enlist, entering in December 2022, was not a quiet personal moment. It was a documented public event covered by international press outlets including Reuters, BBC, and major South Korean broadcasters. Fans gathered in significant numbers near the discharge location despite no official announcement of the exact timing or location of his release. The moment a credible rumor circulated online, the logistics of the situation changed entirely and immediately. What makes Jin's case particularly illustrative is the contrast with his personality. Across years of content, BTS's own variety programming, behind-the-scenes footage, and candid fan interactions, Jin has consistently presented himself as someone who genuinely enjoys simple, ordinary pleasures. He has spoken openly about his love of gaming, eating good food, and watching movies. He hosted a cooking segment. He fishes. These are the hobbies of someone who values quiet, personal time. Yet the documented reality of his public life creates a permanent structural gap between who he is privately and what the outside world makes possible for him. The cost of that gap is something Jin has addressed with his characteristic dry humor rather than complaint, which, arguably, makes the underlying reality land harder than any dramatic retelling could. When Jimin describes losing access to ordinary life and makes a joke about it, the joke only works because the loss is real. Number 6. No full creative control over solo music. Suga. Min Yoongi, known professionally as Suga, and under his solo alias August D, born March 9, 1993, in Daegu, South Korea, has one of the most thoroughly documented creative identities in contemporary pop music. He started writing and producing music as a teenager in Daegu, hustling in the underground hip-hop scene before Big Hit Entertainment signed him. He has producing credits on hundreds of songs. He composed tracks that charted globally. He is, by any reasonable professional standard, a fully formed, technically skilled musician who understands the industry from the inside out. And yet the degree of creative autonomy he exercises over his own music, even his solo output, operates within a framework of institutional and commercial constraints that he has discussed with striking frankness. The structure matters here. BTS operates under HYBE, formerly Big Hit Entertainment, a publicly traded company on the Korea Exchange since October 2020, with a market capitalization that at its peak exceeded 10 trillion Korean won, roughly equivalent to over $8 billion. When a company is publicly traded, creative decisions stop being purely artistic decisions. They become business decisions with shareholder implications. The music that BTS members release, including solo projects, goes through label infrastructure, approval processes, marketing alignment, scheduling coordination, and commercial viability assessments that no individual artist within the system fully controls, regardless of their internal stature or creative reputation. Suga's August D mixtapes, released in 2016 and 2020 as free downloads, existed in a specific lane precisely because they operated outside the standard commercial release framework. They were not sold. They were not pushed through conventional chart eligibility pipelines initially. The 2016 August D tape, which contains some of the most direct, autobiographical content Suga has ever released, including explicit discussions of his mental health struggles, his pre-debut poverty, his experience with depression and social phobia, landed differently from official BTS releases because it carried a rawness that the standard label release process tends to sand down. Suga himself acknowledged in interviews that the mixtape format gave him freedom that a formal album would not have provided in the same way. When D-Day, his 2023 full-length studio album released under the August D name, came out through HYBE label, the process was visibly different. It was a commercial release with a global rollout, a world tour, streaming platform coordination, and physical album versions with standard K-pop industry packaging conventions. The music itself remained substantive and critically well received. But the infrastructure surrounding it was fully institutional, which by definition means fully collaborative with parties whose interests extend beyond pure artistic expression. Suga has discussed the tension between artistic intent and commercial reality in multiple interviews with notable directness for an artist at his level. In a 2023 interview with Rolling Stone, he addressed the difficulty of maintaining artistic identity within a system designed primarily around scale and commercial output. He has spoken about the difference between what he wants to make and what the situation around him makes practical, a distinction that most artists in major label systems understand intimately but rarely articulate as clearly as he does. His March 2024 enlistment into the Social Service Worker Program, a form of alternative military service tied to his 2020 DUI case involving an electric scooter, added another layer of institutional constraint to his timeline, temporarily removing him from any creative output entirely, not by creative choice, but by legal and military obligation. The most skilled producer in the group, and the one most openly vocal about creative integrity, still operates inside a machine that's larger than any one person's vision. That tension doesn't disappear because you're famous. Sometimes fame is exactly what makes it permanent. Next up, what happens when your love life is considered everyone else's business? Number 5. No right to date publicly without consequence. Jimin. Park Jimin, born October 13, 1995, in Busan, South Korea, is the BTS member who has perhaps most visibly lived at the intersection of intense parasocial devotion and the near-total erasure of romantic privacy. His position within BTS's fanbase dynamic is specific and well documented, consistently ranking at or near the top of individual member popularity polls globally, winner of the Guinness World Record for the first solo K-pop artist to debut at #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 with his 2023 single, Like Crazy, and the subject of a volume of fan attention that operates at an intensity that makes conventional romantic life structurally complicated in ways that go well beyond ordinary celebrity. The K-pop industry's relationship with idol dating is not a rumor or a fan theory. It is a documented business practice with contractual and commercial roots that researchers, journalists, and former industry insiders have discussed extensively. The underlying logic is transactional and straightforward. A significant portion of K-pop fandom engagement, including album purchases, streaming, concert attendance, and merchandise spending, is driven by parasocial attachment, meaning fans form emotional bonds with artists that feel personal and exclusive. The moment a public confirmation of romantic involvement enters that dynamic, a measurable segment of that fanbase psychologically exits the parasocial relationship. For agencies managing artists at BTS's commercial scale, that exit has direct revenue implications. HYBE and its predecessor Big Hit Entertainment have never published an explicit public, no dating clause in any contract made available for public review. However, the practical reality across BTS's career has been consistent and observable. No member has ever publicly confirmed a romantic relationship while the group was in its primary active commercial phase. This is not coincidence across 7 people over more than a decade. It reflects an environment, contractual, cultural, and commercial, in which public dating carries consequences significant enough to function as a practical prohibition even without a written rule being cited. Jimin's specific situation illustrates the stakes most clearly. In January 2023, South Korean outlet Dispatch, which has a well-established industry practice of releasing celebrity relationship reports on New Year's Day, published a report claiming Jimin was in a relationship with actor Ha Yeon-soo. The report included photographs. The response was immediate, polarized, and revealing. A segment of the global fanbase reacted with genuine distress. Social media engagement around Jimin's name spiked dramatically. HYBE did not confirm or deny the report. Ha Yeon-soo's agency denied the relationship. The situation resolved into official ambiguity, which is itself a documented pattern in K-pop relationship management, where neither confirmation nor denial is accidental. What makes this particularly pointed in Jimin's case is the documented emotional intelligence he brings to fan relationships. Across years of Weverse posts, live streams, and interview content, Jimin has been consistently expressive about his feelings toward ARMY in ways that are genuine and specific rather than performative. He has spoken about loneliness. He has spoken about the difficulty of maintaining personal connections outside the group. He has described the members as his primary emotional support structure, which, given the constraints on his external personal life, is not simply a warm sentiment, but a description of a real structural reality. A man who processes emotion publicly with that level of honesty, operating inside a system where his romantic life cannot be publicly acknowledged without triggering a managed crisis, the gap between who he is and what his circumstances permit says more than any dramatic framing ever could. The fans who love him most are, in a documented and measurable way, part of the reason he can't love freely. That's not an accusation. It's just the shape of the situation. And the next member on this list couldn't even choose when to serve his country. Number 4, no choice over military service timeline, RM. Kim Nam-jun, known professionally as RM, born September 12, 1994, in Ilsan, South Korea, spent years at the center of one of the most publicly debated military service questions in South Korean modern history. Not because he avoided the issue. Not because he was evasive about it. But because the question of when and whether BTS members would serve in the mandatory military system became a genuine national policy debate, discussed in the South Korean National Assembly, covered by international press, and ultimately resolved by a legislative amendment that was specifically and openly influenced by BTS's cultural and economic significance, meaning RM and his members had the extraordinary experience of watching their personal life timeline become a subject of parliamentary deliberation. South Korea's mandatory military service requirement is grounded in the Military Service Act, and applies to virtually all able-bodied male citizens between the ages of 18 and 28. The standard service period for active duty Army enlisted personnel is approximately 18 months. Exemptions exist but are narrow and historically reserved for athletes, specifically Olympic medal winners and Asian Games gold medalists, and classical musicians who win designated international competitions. The exemptions exist because the government has formally determined that certain forms of national cultural representation carry strategic value equivalent to military contribution. Before BTS, the pop music industry had never been included in that calculation. The debate that surrounded BTS's service eligibility was not fan-driven wishful thinking. It entered formal legislative channels. In 2020 and 2021, multiple South Korean lawmakers introduced and discussed amendments to the Military Service Act that would have extended the popular culture exemption to include artists who had made demonstrable contributions to national prestige, a category BTS fit by any measurable standard, given their documented economic contribution to South Korea estimated by the Hyundai Research Institute at approximately 4.65 trillion Korean won annually at their commercial peak, and their role as the most globally visible ambassadors of Korean culture during the Hallyu Wave's most internationally impactful period. RM, as the leader and most publicly articulate member of BTS, addressed the military service question directly in ways that revealed the genuine constraint involved. In a 2020 press conference following BTS's appointment as special presidential envoys for future generations and culture by South Korean President Moon Jae-in, a formal government role that involved addressing the United Nations General Assembly in September 2021, RM stated clearly that BTS would comply with whatever the law required. That statement sounds straightforward. It wasn't. It was a public acknowledgement that the decision about one of the most significant periods of his life, a roughly 2-year window of mandatory service that would pause his career, his creative output, and his public presence, was entirely outside his personal control. The legislative amendment that eventually passed in December 2022 allowed BTS members to delay enlistment until age 30 rather than 28, but it did not exempt them. It postponed the inevitable without eliminating it. RM enlisted in December 2023 at Nonsan Army Training Center, completing basic training before being assigned to a frontline division. His enlistment was covered by international media including AP, Reuters, and BBC. Fans gathered outside the training center. His entrance into the military was a public event he had no meaningful agency over, not the timing in any ultimate sense, not the duration, not the terms. The man who wrote and delivered a speech to the United Nations about identity, self-love, and finding your own voice, that same man could not choose when his own life would be placed on hold by his government. The law applied to him the same way it applies to everyone, and the years of public debate that preceded his enlistment only made the lack of personal choice more visible, not less real. Legislative bodies discussed his future. He waited to find out what they decided. That's not a metaphor. That's exactly what happened. And it turns out, military service isn't the only thing BTS members can't control. Sometimes it's something as simple as speaking their minds. Number 3, no freedom to speak politically without triggering an international incident. V. Kim Tae-young, known professionally as V, born December 30, 1995, in Daegu, South Korea, occupies a specific and well-documented position in BTS's public profile that makes the constraint of political speech particularly visible in his case. He is consistently ranked among the most followed individuals on Instagram globally, surpassing 70 million followers within weeks of creating his account in 2021 and continuing to grow at a rate that places him in the same measurable tier as athletes and entertainers with decades-long public careers. That reach means that anything he says, or conspicuously does not say, about politically sensitive subjects lands with the weight of a broadcast, not a personal opinion. The structural reality here begins with geography and history. BTS operates primarily out of South Korea, a country with a specific and complicated relationship with its northern neighbor, with Japan, with China, and with the United States, for geopolitical relationships that each carry historical weight significant enough that a single carelessly framed public statement from a figure of BTS's visibility can generate formal diplomatic responses. This is not hypothetical. It has happened. The most thoroughly documented case involves the entire group rather than V specifically, but it establishes the environment he operates in with precision. In October 2020, BTS received the Van Fleet Award from the Korea Society, a New York-based nonprofit that promotes U.S.-Korea relations. RM delivered an acceptance speech in which he referenced the Korean War, specifically describing it as a shared sacrifice between the two nations. The speech was praised in the United States and South Korea. In China, state-affiliated media outlet Global Times published criticism arguing that the speech had failed to acknowledge Chinese casualties in the war China fought on the North Korean side, and framed the omission as deliberate disrespect. The response from Chinese social media was significant enough that Samsung, one of BTS's major commercial partners at the time, temporarily removed BTS-related content from its Chinese platforms. A carefully worded, formally prepared acceptance speech delivered at a nonprofit award ceremony generated a multinational corporate crisis within 48 hours. V's individual situation carries additional layers. In late 2022 and into 2023, his public friendship with South Korean President Yoon Suk Yeol's inner circle, specifically his documented personal connection with people associated with the presidential administration, became a topic of significant domestic political commentary in South Korea. His presence at gatherings connected to political figures was reported by South Korean media, and generated public debate about the appropriate boundaries between celebrity and political association. V did not make political statements. His physical proximity to political figures was sufficient to generate controversy. The constraint, in his case, operates even at the level of personal relationships and social appearances, not just spoken words. The broader K-pop industry context reinforces how deliberately BTS and HYBE have navigated political speech. Across more than a decade of public activity, BTS has addressed social themes, mental health, self-acceptance, youth anxiety, anti-violence messaging in their partnership with UNICEF, while maintaining careful distance from electoral politics, foreign policy positions, and interstate historical disputes. That consistency across 7 members over 10+ years, in an era of social media where individual opinions surface constantly, reflects institutional discipline rather than personal indifference. V has spoken in interviews about the weight of public representation, the awareness that his words carry consequences he cannot fully predict or contain. For someone whose natural public persona across variety content, Weverse interactions, and behind-the-scenes footage reads as spontaneous, emotionally expressive, and genuinely uncalculated, operating inside a communication framework where spontaneity carries geopolitical risk is a specific and non-trivial constraint. He has 70 million people listening to everything he says. And the safest thing he can do with that audience on the subjects that matter most globally is say almost nothing at all. The next member on this list faces a constraint that's even more personal, one that lives inside his own body. Number 2, no guarantee of physical and mental health privacy, Jungkook. Jungkook, born September 1, 1997, in Busan, South Korea, joined Big Hit Entertainment at age 15, which means he has spent virtually his entire adult life, and a significant portion of his adolescence, in a state of near-total public visibility. He is the youngest member of BTS, referred to within the group and fandom as the Magne, and he entered one of the most demanding performance environments in the contemporary music industry before most teenagers have finished high school. The physical and psychological consequences of that trajectory are not speculation. They are documented, publicly disclosed, and reveal a specific category of lost freedom that cuts closer than fame or scheduling or political speech, the freedom to experience your own body breaking down without the entire world watching and commenting. The physical documentation begins early and accumulates across BTS's career in ways that illustrate the structural impossibility of health privacy at their scale. In 2019, Jungkook sustained a leg injury during a performance in Saudi Arabia significant enough to require medical attention and affect subsequent scheduling. In October 2023, he underwent surgery on his right hand to repair a tendon injury, an injury sustained during preparation for his solo activities and the release of his debut solo album Golden. HYBE issued an official statement. The surgery was reported internationally. Fan communities organized support projects. Medical details about a 26-year-old man's hand surgery became global news, discussed across platforms by millions of people who had no personal connection to him, and no medical context for evaluating what the injury meant for his recovery or his long-term career. That specific dynamic, where a private medical event becomes a public information cycle within hours, is not unique to Jungkook within BTS, but his case illustrates it with particular clarity because of the timing. The hand surgery occurred immediately before the release of Golden, his first full solo album, meaning his medical situation was inseparable from one of the most commercially significant moments of his solo career. His recovery timeline was not a personal matter between him, his doctors, and people who loved him. It was a variable in a commercial equation that involved album sales projections, promotional scheduling, and investor sentiment in a publicly traded company. The mental health dimension is equally documented and equally revealing. Jungkook has spoken across multiple interviews and fan communication platforms about anxiety, about the psychological pressure of performance, and about the difficulty of maintaining emotional stability under sustained public scrutiny. In a 2022 BTS Festa interview, an annual format where members speak candidly about their experiences, Jungkook addressed feelings of uncertainty about his identity outside of BTS, describing a version of the question that many people who enter high-pressure professional environments young eventually face: who am I when I'm not performing this role? That question, for most people, gets processed privately. For Jungkook, it was processed in front of a live audience and then clipped, subtitled, analyzed, and redistributed across social media platforms within hours. The K-pop industry's physical demands on performers are well documented by researchers and former industry professionals. Rigorous training schedules, performance frequency, international touring across time zones, and the sustained pressure of maintaining physical appearance standards create conditions that sports medicine professionals and psychologists have identified as structurally conducive to both physical injury and burnout. Jungkook entered that system at 15. By the time BTS announced their hiatus from group activities in 2022, an announcement made at their Festa dinner that year, broadcast live, where members discussed exhaustion and creative depletion with visible emotional rawness, he was 24 years old and had already spent 9 years inside that system. The moment that Festa dinner broadcast ended, the clips were everywhere. The most vulnerable conversation those 7 people had probably ever shared publicly became content, analyzed, debated, praised, and critiqued by an audience of millions who each brought their own needs and interpretations to a moment that was, at its core, just a group of young men telling the truth about being tired. Jungkook couldn't even be exhausted in private. And the final member on this list faces perhaps the most quietly suffocating constraint of all, one that has nothing to do with performance, politics, or physical health, and everything to do with who he's allowed to simply be. Number 1, no freedom to define his own identity outside the group, J-Hope. Jungkook, known professionally as J-Hope, born February 18, 1994, in Gwangju, South Korea, presents what is arguably the most structurally complex identity constraint of any BTS member, precisely because it operates at the level most people never think to examine. Not physical movement. Not romantic life. Not political speech. Not medical privacy. But the most fundamental layer of personal existence, the freedom to be perceived as a complete, contradictory, evolving human being rather than a fixed role inside a globally defined cultural product. J-Hope's public identity within BTS is one of the most thoroughly codified in K-pop history. He is the hope, the designated optimism, the persistent energy, the member whose stage presence and off-stage persona have been so consistently associated with positivity, brightness, and emotional uplift that the association has calcified into expectation. That codification did not happen accidentally. It developed across years of content, branding decisions, fan community shorthand, and media framing until the gap between Jungkook the person and J-Hope the cultural symbol became both invisible and structurally load-bearing, meaning the entire architecture of how millions of people relate to BTS carries weight on that particular characterization of him. The constraint this creates is documented most clearly through his solo work. In 2022, J-Hope released Jack in the Box, his first official studio album, and the artistic choices he made were a deliberate and visible departure from the brightness his public identity had been built around. The album was dark, sonically aggressive, lyrically confrontational, rooted in trap and alternative hip-hop rather than the performance-driven pop energy most associated with his BTS persona. The opening track intro, Jack in the Box, referenced the fairy tale figure whose defining characteristic is the tension between a contained, expected presentation and something more volatile and unpredictable waiting underneath. The reference was not subtle. It was a direct artistic statement about the experience of being perceived as one thing while being more complicated than that perception allows. Critical reception to Jack in the Box was substantive and largely positive, with music journalists noting the deliberate tonal distance from his established image as one of the album's defining features. But the fan reception revealed the constraint in real time. A measurable portion of the response engaged not with the music on its own terms, but with the dissonance between what they expected from J-Hope and what the album actually delivered. The surprise itself, the fact that Darkness from him registered as surprising at all, demonstrated exactly the problem the album was addressing. He had released music that said, "I contain more than you think," and a significant part of the audience responded by being startled that he contained more than they thought. His Lollapalooza 2022 headlining set, the first South Korean solo artist to headline the main stage at a major Western music festival, delivered a performance that was physically demanding, technically rigorous, and demonstrated range well beyond his BTS-specific role. The set was documented, praised, and widely covered. It also existed inside the same structural reality. Jimin headlining one of the world's most significant music festivals was still being primarily described in relation to his position within a 7-member group rather than as an autonomous artistic entity. J-Hope enlisted in the South Korean military in April 2023, notably as the first BTS member to voluntarily enlist without waiting for the legislative deadline extension, a decision that itself generated extensive public analysis, with fans and media interpreting the timing as meaningful in various directions. His personal decision about when to fulfill a legal obligation became a text to be decoded by millions of people, each reading his motivations through the lens of what they needed him to represent. A private decision. A public interpretation event. What makes J-Hope's constraint the most quietly significant on this list is that it operates without obvious external enforcement. Nobody is stopping him from being complex. The mechanism is subtler and more durable than a rule or a contract. It is the accumulated weight of millions of people's emotional investment in a version of him that predates their knowledge of who he actually is. That weight doesn't disappear when he releases a dark album, or headlines a festival, or makes a personal decision about military service. It reasserts itself in every surprised reaction, every reductive description, every moment where the person and the symbol fail to fully overlap. 7 members. 7 documented, verifiable, specific constraints. None of them chosen. All of them the direct consequence of a scale of fame that the world produces very rarely, and has very few honest frameworks for understanding. BTS didn't just change the music industry. They became a case study in what it costs, in the most human and specific terms, to matter that much to that many people at once.